There we go. You would think this is the first time I did this. Good morning, friends. I want to extend a warm welcome to you today. Everyone is welcome here. This community is a safe place where we support each other in the sacred task of becoming. We are a humanist congregation. Our goal is increased consciousness so that we can live our greatest possible being and participate in society with love, compassion, and justice. In this congregation, we have faith in the inherent worth and dignity of all people, believe we are part of the interdependent web of existence, celebrate the transcending mystery of life, and rely on the transforming power of love. Everyone is welcome here, irregardless of your politics, criminal record, religious proclivities, gender identity, who you love, or if you are unsure of any or all of the above categories. You are human, and we are glad you are here. By way of introduction for this service, the theme today is Black Lives Matter, a phrase that the Vice President of the United States will not say and is, according to our President, a symbol of hate. I only assume that they are giving Black Lives Matter this kind of treatment because they are appealing to a base that is angry, fearful, and racist, hoping that by offering up Black and brown people as scapegoats for the increasing misery and brokenness in this country, that they will gather in some political gain. Needless to say, the President and Vice President and their base deserve our deepest compassion. It's a difficult task, which is part of the reason why Unitarian Universalism, Unitarian Universalists like ourselves, have weekly worship services instead of once-in-a-lifetime training sessions. For many, Unitarian Universalists, love and consciousness are two words with one nearly identical meaning. To love is to give attention to bring consciousness is to love. It is with this in mind that we bring you this service. Tracy Crenshaw and Catherine Lyon, who are members of this congregation, will share their thoughts. Special speakers Rudy Gourdine, Regina Williams-Preston, and Darryl Heller will share their perspectives and expertise as we give attention to Black Lives Matter. Additionally, Chloe and Candace will light the chalice and extinguish it for us, and Glenn Smith will introduce a video that he has recommended for us. Okay, well, I'll do my reading, and then I'll hopefully we'll have it by then, because we really want to hear it. Before I begin my reading, I just want to acknowledge that this is an idea I brought up to several members of the congregation before, and there has been some stern disagreement with my theory, or the theory that I'm about to present. For those folks, I apologize. This very brief talk is titled "Why I Am a Racist." It is not about why I have chosen racism as a part of my life philosophy. I have not. I am, however, a racist, and I want to explain. I do this because there are millions of very nice people in this country who were raised by enlightened parents, love their spouses and kids, faithfully attend PTA meetings, have neatly trimmed front lawns, always wear their masks in public, and would give you the shirts off their back, who are racist even though they say they are not, even though they think they are not. The collective effect of millions of unconsciously racist people like us, like you and me, is manifest in our current racial difficulties and brokenness in this country. Metaphorically speaking, we all have a racist meme which resides in our cultural DNA. The message imprinted on our racist meme is Black and brown people are less than white people. Everyone carries the meme. Or, as Pulitzer Prize winning columnist Leonard Pitts says, for an American to say they are not racist is like a fish saying that it is not wet. Racism in America is so pervasive, so endemic, that everyone is affected and infected. An example, often when I go into a restaurant or a store and a young Black man or Black woman serves me or is operating a cash register, my racist meme will manifest in me with thoughts like, I hope she gets the change right, or what if she messes up my order? My feeling is one of anxiety. The message my meme is manifesting me is that Black people, especially young Black people, are not competent, or at least not as competent as white people. The racist meme manifests in us even if we are Black. A long time ago in the far off and exotic land of Chicago, where my wife, Patty, and I were attending seminary, our upstairs neighbors in married student housing was a Black couple Edith and Cliff. Cliff was there getting a doctorate in theological studies and had what I thought was an unnatural obsession with the Holy Trinity. Their kids and our kids were about the same age, between about 1 and 3 years old. We started trading babysitting and eventually became friends. Edith and I talked quite a bit. One conversation that stands out was the time when Edith and Cliff had a plumbing problem. Edith reported the situation to Seminary Housing, and a plumber was sent out to fix the problem. When Edith, who was, as I mentioned, black and had been so for as long as she could remember, opened the door and saw a black plumber, she immediately felt anxiety and thought, how can a black man be a good plumber? She would later confided to me that she was startled at her racist ideation and emotions. As I said, it is my opinion that we all, black, white, brown, LGBT, and Q, possess a racist meme in the makeup of our cultural DNA. And as I also mentioned, the message imprinted on that meme is black people are less than white people. When the racist meme manifests in some white people, they automatically assume this is the natural order and then project their own feelings of inferiority onto black people. This has the effect of lightening their psychological burdens, but also creates soul-destroying hate. I feel some compassion for the assault rifle-toting, swastika-wearing, Confederate flag-waving white nationalists. They do not realize that by being unwilling to suffer their own feelings of the impotence and inferiority that they have chosen the path of weakness and cowardice. When the racist meme manifests in black people, its message is you are less than. It becomes a psychological burden. This meme is stressful to bear and creates all kinds of health issues for black people, and in some black people, anger and diminishment of being. The antidote for the racist meme, be you black or white, is consciousness, which, as I mentioned before, is another word for love. If we can become conscious of our racist memes when they manifest in our psyches, we can dispassionately observe them and in so doing neutralize them. With consciousness comes understanding. With understanding comes the ability to stop projecting our feelings of inferiority on blacks if we are white, and to lighten our psychological and spiritual burdens if we are black, thus helping to ameliorate at least some of the suffering and hate that currently stricken our society. We are seeing some signs of hope. In the nearly 6 weeks since George Floyd's death, we are seeing hundreds of millions of Americans becoming aware of systemic racism and our 400-year-long history of exploitation of black people. Thousands have taken to the streets in protest. Police reform bills are currently under discussion in the House and Senate. Symbols of the old Confederacy and white supremacy are being removed from public places, and there is real talk about reparation. It is, however, my particular opinion that the real healing of our nation will begin when we bring consciousness to the fact that racism is a disease with which we are all infected. And now Reverend Rudy Gourdine will speak to us on his family's experience with racism.
Thanks, Jim, for inviting me. Jim and I go way back, as they say. I'm glad to be here. Growing up when I was in high school, I was my uncle's fishing buddy during the summer months. I grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia, which is part of what's called the Tidewater region of Virginia. We would launch our boat on the Elizabeth River and headed north to the Chesapeake Bay, where we sank anchor and threw out our lines on the bay's waters. Spots and croakers were plentiful in those days, and occasionally we had one of those dreadful dogfish sharks tangled in our lines. One of my uncle's boat, as we were rocking back and forth, I wasn't aware of two things at the time. One had to do with my ancestors, and the other had to do with my uncle, Uncle Mac. Mac Paul Gourdine is his name. I was not aware, at least on an emotional level, that the very body of water in which we were anchored, the Chesapeake Bay, was a major corridor for the slave trade from the continent of Africa to north from the bay, like Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and cities in Maryland. You know that Jamestown was the first English settlement in colonial America. That small colony was on the James River that flows into the Chesapeake Bay. And in 1619, 20 blacks were taken to Jamestown against their will and sold as indentured servants. That's the beginning of tens of thousands of Africans transported here against their will to be sold in slavery. It only accelerated when tobacco became the cash crop of Virginia and the Carolinas. I wonder if I knew then what I know now about the slave trade, if my perception would have been different on that bay when I was fishing. I wonder if out of my peripheral vision, I would have seen the ghost of one of those slave ships cutting through the waves. I wonder if I would have heard in the wind the cries of my ancestors chained in the cargo hold of these crafts in unbearable heat and unimaginable unsanitary conditions. I wonder if I would have felt deep within my soul the agony of my people being ripped from their native soil, from their mothers and fathers, from their brothers and sisters, and from their aunts and uncles in their community. I wonder if I would have felt their pain. I don't know. I don't know if that would have been the case, but I do know for sure that for the men and women who jumped overboard and drowned in the Chesapeake Bay to avoid the existence of captivity, I would have at least realized that I was in sacred waters. I hope I would have been more reverent than what I was at the time. The other thing that I wasn't aware of at the time had to do with my fishing buddy, my own Uncle Mac. The base commander where my uncle was working was discriminating against Uncle Mac and other black civil servants at the time. This was in the 50s and late 60s, and like African Americans of his generation, they didn't want to burden others with their trials and tribulations of racism, especially their family, their kids. My uncle was an airplane engine mechanic for the Norfolk Naval Air Force Base in Norfolk, Virginia. Granted, it was a good job with great governmental benefits, but he was consistently overlooked for promotions. He saw people that he trained eventually become his supervisors. Of course, they were white men with less education and experience than himself. These were the same men he had eventually had to answer to. He also later found out that the practice of discrimination was typical of other blacks in the government. My uncle became wearied of this practice, and as Fannie Lou Hammond would say, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Uncle Mac filed suit against the commander of the base and for this practice and won the suit after it went all the way to the Department of Navy in Washington, D.C. After winning the case, he became one of the first black civil servants supervisors in government. But if I would have known this at the time, I would have predicted the outcome. Uncle Mac was the most resilient and tenacious fisherman I knew. If the spots and croakers weren't biting in one area of the bay, he would waste no time before pulling up anchor and going to the next location. That was the way my Uncle Mac was. So that's my story.
Thank you, Rudy. Regina.
There we go. Is that helpful? Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I was asked to talk about systemic racism in schools. And having been a teacher in the schools for 20 years, I can tell you we don't talk about systemic racism. We talk all around it, but we don't name it. That is a part of systemic racism. Language itself is a tool of oppression. It's easier for us to say disproportionality than systemic racism. It's easier to swallow because the word racism is way too scary, and disproportionality is much more comfortable. So if you've been talking about these issues lately, you may have been feeling some discomfort, and that's what it will take to end systemic racism, some really uncomfortable conversations. The federal government uses this term disproportionality to describe the outcomes of discrimination and racism in schools, and we've used it for a very long time. There are laws prohibiting disproportionality and consequences for significant disproportionality, meaning data demonstrating disproportionate outcomes for more than 3 years. Disproportionality is defined as the overrepresentation or underrepresentation of a particular population or demographic group in any category relative to the presence of this group in the overall population. So that's a lot of pretty words, but what does that mean in real life? What does it look like? We understand disproportionate outcomes, but how do we determine disproportionality by the numbers? Our data on out-of-school suspensions, like districts all over the country, shows disproportionality in discipline. So what exactly does that look like? In an equitable environment, the distribution of suspensions across different groups of students, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, or race, are expected to be equal to the proportion of that group's enrollment. In this example, white students are 29% of the student body and receive 29% of the suspensions. Black students are 37% of the student body and receive 37% of the suspensions. This is an unequal percentage of suspension, but it is proportionate to the percentage of students in the population. This is not equal, but it is equitable. Now let's look at the actual data. White students are 29% of the student body and receive 15% of suspensions. Black students are 37% of the student body and receive 62% of suspensions. This is an unequal percentage of suspension, but this time it is disproportionate to the percentage of children in the population. So this is unequitable. Black students get more suspensions than would be expected in an equitable environment. This is disproportionate, and in this case, it's almost double what we would expect. So some of you may have seen me deliver these numbers in the past, so it may not be surprising. What is important to note, however, is that in the 10 years I've been sharing this information, the numbers have not changed. If anything, we are seeing that disproportionality is increasing. So what does this all mean, and what can we do about it? A lot of people believe African American students get suspended more because they misbehave more. And this is a common misperception. 40 years of research on school discipline demonstrates that there's no evidence of racial disparities in discipline that racial disparities in discipline are due to higher rates of misbehavior by Black students. In fact, those students are punished more severely for similar or less serious behaviors than their peers. So let's talk about the impact of disproportionate discipline. Of all days of out-of-school suspension, white students were assigned 1,962 days of exclusion. And this is where I usually give people a chance to just kind of wonder in their own mind, we know it's disproportionate, but what do you think that Black students might have been assigned? Well, the numbers say 8,827 days. And we know that every missed day of instruction, of of school is a missed day of instruction. And as teachers, we just had to run the numbers. 7 classes a day, 47 minutes a class, almost 3 million minutes of lost instruction for Black students in that 1 year alone. Now, what you need to know, like, this doesn't mean much until you realize that there are only 59,000 minutes of instruction in an entire school year. This equates to approximately 50 years of missed instruction. 50 students missing an entire year, or 200 students missing an entire grading period for minor, nonviolent offenses like skipping class or talking back. Now, if we could somehow recapture some of these instructional minutes, how many more African American students would pass I-STEP, would graduate with a general diploma, or enroll in honors and advanced placement courses? Now, one of the questions a lot of people are asking, what behaviors account for disproportionate suspensions? Well, the national data shows us that Black students and white students are pretty much suspended for the same things, but there are a few significant differences. The national data show that of 32 types of infractions, there are only 8 significant differences in why African American students and white students are referred to the office. So take a look at these lists. What do you notice? Most people see that the white students are referred for objective reasons. You were smoking or you weren't. You wrote on the desk or you didn't. You were in class or you weren't. While African American students are referred for subjective reasons. What does insubordinate mean? How loud is too loud? Well, I felt intimidated. And I've done this presentation like a million times over the years. And one day, one person pointed out that the list of infractions for African Americans are all about relationships. He was insubordinate. I felt disrespected. He tried to intimidate me. I felt threatened. We interpret behavior through our own worldview. Our worldview is shaped by our culture. How much could we reduce our office referrals if we were able to change the lens through which we view Black children and improve our relationships with students? So here's the impact. Graduation rates in South Bend schools are already below the state average, and this goes up to year 2017-18. But when you disaggregate graduation based by race, you can clearly see the disparate impact that missing school can have on an entire demographic of children. And then when we look at outcomes in other areas, we can see that there's a direct connection to education. Black unemployment is almost double the rate of whites. The median household income for Black families in South Bend is only $21,000 compared to $41,000 for white families. 37% of Black families have zero net worth compared to 16% for whites. Home ownership rate for Blacks is only 35% compared to 68% for white families. We have to get this right. It is going to take the courage to name it, acknowledge our part in the problem, and take steps to do what we can where we are. Thank you.
Deeper than that, though.
Thank you, Regina. Very powerful. And now Dr. Darryl Heller will talk to us about reparations.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you everyone who's listening today. Thank you, Regina and Rudy as well. Yesterday was the 4th of July, a day known as Independence Day. It is supposed to mark the signing of the Declaration of Independence in the words penned by Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This document included a list of grievances detailing the reasons for severing the ties with Britain, a list of harms that were inflicted on the colonists and which not only required but demanded a response for justice to be served. Like much of American history, this is only part of the story. There are other ways to understand the 4th of July. Frederick Douglass offered another perspective with his passionate speech, "What to the slave is your 4th of July?" which he delivered 168 years ago today. Douglass also presented a list of grievances and harms to which the American government needed to be held to account. Like the Declaration of Independence, Douglass noted the hypocrisy that existed between the words and deeds of those who had power. In this case, between those who called themselves protectors of liberty and justice, yet enslaved people who were darker. A third perspective was offered by a dear friend who argued that we should recognize the 4th of July not as Independence Day, but rather as Dependence Day, in acknowledgement that this nation's founding and professed independence was actually contingent. It was not built on the independent spirit and moral character of the colonists and founding fathers. Rather, its creation was dependent on genocide and the appropriation of land from the indigenous people who were their rightful protectors of the land. It was, as importantly, dependent on slave labor of Africans and African Americans, as was the wealth of those who governed the early nation. We must not forget that 8 presidents owned slaves while holding office. This third set of facts has set a trajectory for the nation's history through today. White wealth has been dependent on Black oppression, marginalization, and exploitation. We cannot achieve the ideals of this nation's founding documents that assert the unalienable rights of everyone unless and until we acknowledge the full history of their denial of its fight for independence from the tyranny of Britain alongside its fight for independence from white supremacy. Danielle Sered, the founder and director of Common Justice, a restorative justice project in Brooklyn, New York, wrote a little book called Until We Reckon, Mass Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. She makes a compelling argument that until we reckon with our history and find new ways of relating, we are doomed to not only repeat the harms that are a central part of this nation's history, but to deepen the wounds that are inflicted with regularity. She argues that harms cannot be repaired without accountability, which require, in her words, 5 distinct steps. We must acknowledge responsibility. We must acknowledge responsibility for our actions. We must acknowledge the impact of one's actions on others. We must express genuine remorse. We must take actions to repair the harm to the degree possible. And we must no longer commit similar harms. America has failed on all accounts when it comes to its Black citizens. The President of the United States gave several speeches this past weekend in which he fails to take responsibility for the nation's actions when it pertains to race. denies that white supremacy exists or the impact that it has, especially to non-white people. He refused to express remorse and continuously engages in actions that exacerbate the harm that has been done. And he refuses to change direction so that these harms are no longer committed. To be clear, Trump is but a symptom, not a cause. The nation throughout its history has failed on all accounts. A true reckoning, as Sured suggests, begins with acknowledging that harm has been done. Healing can only begin when that acknowledgement leads to some form of repair, with trying to correct the harms that one's actions have caused, a real and sincere attempt to make things right. In other words, some form of reparations for the historical racial injustice and anti-Black ideology that Black people have been subjected to is necessary to heal the nation and make it whole. The list of injustices is long and ongoing. Nicole Hannah-Jones, a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, wrote an article in the June 24th edition titled, "What is Owed?" The piece was an historical overview of the injustices perpetrated against African Americans, most recently and devastatingly revealed with the callous and casual murder of George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis. But these harms go back to the early 17th century with the arrival of the first Africans on the shores of British North America's colony in Jamestown, Virginia. The list of harms that span this time period is long and painful and unfinished unless we take the most basic steps to acknowledge them as a step towards repair. Today, we are living with two unprecedented crises: a health pandemic and a crisis in leadership. The President of the United States continues to double down on his magical realism that the economy is coming back, our military is strong and righteous, and white America is becoming great again. He insists that history is and remains the version that we all learned it, that triumphant narrative of, quote, white progress. Despite this twisting of history and the truth, Black lives do matter. Not because Black lives are special, but because all lives matter. The ironic truth is, as revealed by history and our current situation, is that all lives will not matter unless and until we begin to value Black lives. In order to do this, we must do some accounting. This accounting is necessary for the nation to heal. And if the outcome of that accounting is to repair the harm that has been done, an integral component must include reparations. Then and only then can we all heal, including Black people. Thank you.
My parents always told me, work hard and stay in school. Trust the church and leaders of our town. But now that I am older, the violence that I see, the trust I had is slowly breaking down. There's a fire in Ferguson tonight. It's not the kind of fire you see. It burns in everyone who seeks justice, truth, and dignity. I raised my child on food stamps A young black life cut short. Police have turned their guns on you and me. There's a fire in Ferguson tonight. It's not the kind of fire you see. Burns in everyone who seeks justice, truth, and dignity. I never learned to protest. I kept my own house clean, did what was expected, and I prayed. I prayed for equal treatment, for opportunity. I will not give my own child's life in trade. There's a fire in Ferguson tonight. It's not the kind of fire you see. It burns in everyone who seeks justice, truth, and dignity. There's a fire tonight all around the world. There's a fire tonight for Michael Brown. There's a fire tonight. Our voices will be heard. We won't let them cut our children down. Sparks amidst the embers, slowly beaten down. Lives extinguished long before they age. Cries of desperation on ears it will not hear. They vivid in the swirling light of rage. There's a fire in Ferguson tonight. Not the kind of fire you see. It burns in everyone who seeks justice, truth, and dignity. There's a fire in Ferguson tonight. There's a fire in Ferguson tonight. There's a fire tonight.
Go in peace, friends. And if you'd like, stick around for our circle talk and group talks.